I don't... This is my room. I remember some things, but I don't remember this.
It's not Mum, it's not my mum. It's not my mum. It's not my mum.
Mark, open this door. Open this door right now.
It's not my mum.
Open this door.
Bloody hell. Look at the state of this place. Better sort it out before Mum sees it.
Mark, open this door right now.
When danger is near, Stephen Grant has no fear. You made me up.
Open this door right now. You're gonna learn to listen. I didn't have to make him do
I want to
this.
see what she did. I want to see what she did.
Disgusting.
You're not meant to see that. You're not meant to see that. That's the whole point of you.
Oh. The point of me? The point of me, what, to be your stress ball? All this time I thought I was the original. But I'm just something that you made up.
You've got to live a happy, simple, normal life. You understand?
But it was all a lie, wasn't it?
So what? What does it matter? What, you want to remember the truth? That you had a mother that beat you? That hated you? That made your life a living hell?
You're lying, you're just trying to upset me.
But you've gotten to live thinking that she loved you, that she was kind, that she's still alive.
What are you talking about? She's alive. I speak to her every day. What are you talking about?
Dad called me after all these years about her Shiva, and I couldn't do it.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and welcoming back a returning guest. This time he's flying solo. We don't have Gordon with us, and that's Sai Islam. Sai, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Happy to be here talking about Moon Knight.
Yeah, same here. I just finished the rewatch of it last night. I watched the first 3 episodes the night before, and then the next 3 last night. But before we jump into it, since it's only your second time on the show, why don't you give people a reminder about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I wear a couple of different hats. I'm a associate professor of industrial organizational psychology at Farmingdale State College, and I'm also the vice president of consulting with a consulting firm called Talent Metrics. And so the first time I was here, we were talking about leadership in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is the name of the book that I co-authored with my friend Gordon. It's called Leaders Assemble. You can look it up any place where books are sold. It actually officially comes out on June 7th, which is about a week after we're recording this podcast.
Yeah, so it'll definitely be out by the time people listen to this, because I think this episode will actually be dropping in July, if I'm not mistaken, or possibly August. I'm not exactly sure 100% of the timeline we got set up. But yeah, so we're talking about Moon Knight, and this was your suggestion to come on and talk about. So, and I know from our last conversation that you're a Marvel fan from going way back. So, what was your familiarity with Moon Knight before this series, if any? Because I know even among Marvel fans, he's not exactly the most well-known character.
Definitely not. So I've read a lot of Marvel comics over the years, and I only had a passing familiarity with Moon Knight. The most that I'd read about him was in West Coast Avengers when he was on the team. Mm-hmm. And he always struck me as being kind of a weird fit for that team, because you had like Tigra, you had Hawkeye, you had Hank Pym, and this was during like the transition between the Steve Englehart run and the John Byrne run. So there was some weird stuff going on about like what they were going to do with the character. And I never totally got the character. I heard a lot about him. Mm-hmm. And the thing that I liked the most about Moon Knight was not any of the stories. I really loved a lot of the art. They had a lot of Sienkiewicz art, and he's always had very good artists. So Stephen Platt, I remember from the '90s, had a really strong run of Moon Knight stories, and then in the last like 20 years, I feel like Moon Knight has become a more prominent character than I remember him as a kid. As a kid,
Definitely.
he had like he had like a couple of one-off series. He was, he popped up in like Werewolf by Night. He would show up in these different issues. But in the last 20 years, he's really come around. I mean, he's had more solid runs. It's just that I have not had a chance to read any of those. So this was really my introduction to Moon Knight. I did do a little digging around the Marvel Encyclopedia just to read a little bit about the character, because there were only a couple of things I knew about the character. One was that he had some mystical element because he was supposed to be the Fist of Khonshu. And then the comparison I always heard was that he was Marvel's Batman.
Right.
Which, from like what I remember in West Coast Avengers, made zero sense to me. Right? That comparison was like, these are two guys that are hanging out at night. Maybe they're both talking to themselves or something. But that comparison never made sense. I mean, maybe because the main alter ego for Moon Knight, Mark Spector, is supposed to be at some point a billionaire. I guess that was the comparison, but it just never. None of the stories especially in West Coast Avengers, ever struck me as being particularly Batmanish.
Right.
So I don't know. What is your experience with Moon Knight?
So yeah, I kind of came to him late in the game. Like he was a character that I'd always kind of heard about on the edges. He popped up in a few things I was reading. I remember Marvel Knights was a series I was reading back in the late '90s, early 2000s somewhere, and he popped up in there. And that was like really kind of like my first real big introduction to Moon Knight. And I'd heard about him and I'd seen him pop up here and there. But the first time I actually read a Moon Knight comic was Charlie Houston did a run on him in the like 2006, 2007 era, like around the Civil War era is when he did that. And that was amazing. And you're talking about great artists on that. He had David Finch doing the art on that. And that was like, David Finch had been mostly Image and Top Cow at that point, and he had started to break in and do some Marvel stuff. Like I think he had done Ultimate X-Men by this point, but when he did Moon Knight, that was really kind of like, like a career-defining move for him. It really kind of like sent his star rocketing off into the stratosphere once he did that. And then after that, I had gone back and read a lot of the other Moon Knight stuff, and I think at present, I think I own every single Moon Knight trade paperback that is actually in print.
Wow.
So I went back and I've read like the Epic collections, the Doug Moench run, which was, and talk about, loving the Charlie Houston run. Then I went back and I read the Moench stuff from the 80s. And that was an amazing, totally brilliant run. And that was where Sienkiewicz had got his start on. And I'm not sure if you saw this, but I had posted a piece of fan art that I did of Moon Knight, and like the whole crescent shaped cape thing, when that is something that comes straight out of Sienkiewicz's work. Like he always drew Moon Knight's cape as a crescent moon. I always thought that was just so badass, so awesome. And even the scene they had it in there, it only pops up once in the series. But when that scene happened, man, I lost my fucking shit. And my wife's looking at me. She's like, "What's going on?" I'm like, he's doing the moon cake thing. And I had to go and show her like the art. I'm like, look. She's like, "Oh, okay."
What was that awkward moment where you're sharing the Marvel show with your spouse, and if they're not into it, you have to like explain why you geeked out over something?
Yeah.
And then that conversation's always a little weird because then they get to see like the 10-year-old version of you.
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, so I ended up, falling in love with the character thanks to Charlie Houston's introduction. And now the interesting thing is the Batman comparisons weren't so obvious in most of the stuff that you'll find in print nowadays. I think the Batman comparison mostly comes out of that 90s run, the Mark Spector Moon Knight ongoing series, which actually has not been collected. So that's one of the things that I have not read of Moon Knight. And that had, I think a lot of the Batman comparisons came out of that because he was leaning heavily on the billionaire aspect of it, the whole, using the money and the gadgets to fight crime. He had all the moon themed vehicles, like the moon copter. He had a secret hideout in his mansion and all that kind of stuff. And in fact, if I'm recalling correctly, Chuck Dixon had done a lot of those issues, and then he went on to do Batman. So a lot of those comparisons, you definitely see where the Ursat's Batman comparison came from. Now, when you read him in West Coast Avengers, that was when he was in kind of this weird period in his history, because it was such an outlier from the rest of his history. Because the original Moonlight series had been canceled by that point, and they had relaunched it. They had relaunched him in this Moon Knight Fist of Khonshu series. And that was when he was using a lot more. They were leaning much more into the Egyptian side of things, and he had all these Egyptian themed weapons that he was using. And that was, if I'm recalling my history correctly, because Fist of Khonshu I have not read, because that's also not collected. And then Doug Moench and I think it was Sienkiewicz, they did a mini series in the late 90s, I think, that kind of brought the character back to his roots. And that was the other thing that, again, not collected. So there's this huge gap of about 20, maybe 15 years of Moon Knight stories that are not collected. And it seems it's an odd choice, because a lot of the Egyptian themed stuff in this series, if you're mostly familiar, if you like that stuff and then you go to find Moon Knight comics, you're probably going to be a little bit confused, because there's almost none of that in those comics.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I kind of knew that he was the Fifth of Khonshu. I kind of knew a little bit, but there was always, even in West Coast Avengers, everybody thought that Moon Knight was just weird, right? That he was talking to himself, that he actually wasn't engaged with the actual Egyptian deity. Right. I remember that even among the wackos, right, the West Coast Avengers wacky characters, he was always on that edge. He was never really part of that team, and I would only see him pop up in certain comics. I remember that he pops up a little bit in Midnight Suns, right? He was a part of that.
I can't recall. I think he may have popped up there once or twice, but he wasn't a big part of it, at least.
Yeah, he wasn't. It was more Ghost Rider and those characters that were really part of that. But it seems like Marvel wants him to be associated with the Midnight Suns, brand right now. And I can't figure out if he's really a street level hero, or if he's, I'm not sure where Marvel is trying to, the studio is trying to position him.
Right.
I'm not sure where is he right now in the modern Marvel continuity.
I'm not completely up to date on what he's currently doing. I haven't read the new series that's out now, although I've heard it's really good. But I haven't actually read it yet. It seems like, from most of what I've seen, is it seems like it's very much kind of a neoclassic type of take. It's very much in the same vein Moench was doing and that Hewson was doing later on. It seems like very much that style of thing, from what I've heard, or at least what little bit I can piece together. But I think the best comparison for me for Moon Knight has not been, and I can't take credit for this. This is late Derek Ferguson, the host emeritus of the show. He's the one who told me this, and it made so much sense. He said the best comparison. He's like, no, he's not Moon Knight's. He's not Marvel's Batman. Moon Knight is Marvel's take on the Shadow, and that makes so much more sense.
So it's funny you bring that up, because I started reading a little bit about him, and he has a crew of contacts, right? So prior to him having these multiple identities, if I remember correctly, those characters were supposed to be, disguises that he wore to interact with his network, right? And that's very much in line with the Shadow. That definitely sounds a lot more like the Shadow, especially given the sort of more violent take that Moon Knight has on how he deals with criminals and things like that. That's definitely part of the Shadow environment as well. Plus the mystical element, right? The Shadow is supposed to have some sort of mysticism, some mystical powers from the Far East. That totally lines up, and it makes a lot more sense to me than this Batman comparison, which I think is not a great comparison. Yeah. Especially now having thought about the original character and now having seen the show, it's not really a great fit. But as sort of a pulp hero, Marvel's version of a pulp hero, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Exactly, like the Shadow, the Spider, all of those. And you're right. When he first started out, the the identities were very much covered, like, because he had made all his money from, you know, being a bastard of a mercenary and traveling the world killing people. And so then when he came back, he created the Stephen Grant persona to kind of like legitimize himself and his money and all that. So, and then he also created the Jake Lockley persona to be kind of like the man out of the street. So, but over time, the personas he spent so much time in these different personas that they ended up developing in their own personalities. And part of it also had to do with the way his supporting cast would treat him. Like, for example, you had Frenchie, who was Jean-Paul Duchamp, who's, you know, just gets a reference in the cell phone. He's, you know, very much like kind of like an Alfred type character, but he was his pilot. So he was his partner when he was a mercenary. He still calls him Mark. But you have Marlene, who became the Layla character in this series. She's you know, very much like the Vicky Vale, Lois Lane love interest type. She always referred to him as Steven. And then you had the contacts he had. One of the places he would always go to is he'd spend a lot of time in the Jake Lockley persona at this diner. So like you had the woman who was running the diner, her kids, and then the Crawley character, who is, you know, the statue character in this show. They were like his street informants, and they'd all refer to him as Jake Lockley. So you had these different people in his life. All these people he was closest with were all referring to him by different names. And he's transitioning between the different identities and spending so much time in them that eventually they did develop into their own personalities over the course of the character's existence.
Which writer really brought the DID to the forefront?
You know, I'm actually not sure, because I don't know when it happened exactly. It's been a while since I've read the Monk stuff all the way through, but I want to say that it started there. But I don't think it was fully fleshed out there. I think it may have happened in that gap period. That Marvel hasn't released those stories back into print yet.
See, that's what I'm thinking about, because this is definitely like one of the reasons I never got that excited about reading Moon Knight is because anybody I talked to about Moon Knight, I got like 4 different stories of who the character was. It was like, he's a mercenary, he's a billionaire, he's this, he's that. And I was like, well, none of this makes sense. And it's definitely like a pastiche of like a variety of different writers taking a crack at the character. And the best thing about the character has always been the visual. And for a long time, prior to, I think maybe the 90s or even the early 2000s, I think sometimes the character was like a visual looking for a story that could hook a large enough audience to get people to really say like, oh, we really think this is cool. We really want to, you know, read this comic and be a part of it. Because a lot of people that I've spoken to, they're very infatuated with, you know, the way the character looks.
Yeah.
Both in the traditional look, and some people really love the Mr. Knight look, which we get a chance to see in this series. And, you know, some people just like some of the paraphernalia, some of the other stuff associated with it. So a lot of it has to do with those visuals. And, you know, when Bill Sienkiewicz is like the first guy to really come out and do your art, that's going to have a huge impact. You know, I follow him on Instagram and on Twitter, and I love it when he's sharing these pages from that run, because they're really beautiful pieces of art. And I'm glad people are rediscovering those issues now.
Oh yeah, I mean, Sienkiewicz, I mean, you want to talk about a guy who elevated comic art to a totally new level. He's definitely one of those guys. He's, you know, one of the top talents in the business. And, you know, his work on Moon Knight, his work on New Mutants, like unbelievable. Even in other ways, like, you know, in my other podcast, E for Evolution, we talked about some of the issues that he had done the inks on John Paul Leon's art. And even just as an inker, he was amazing. Like, he's just, you know, he's amazing talent all around. And yeah, Moon Knight, there's so much about the visual, and he's a unique character in that I think he hasn't really had a bad costume design. I mean, the Egyptian type stuff in the Fist of Khonshu era looked a little bit odd, but it wasn't necessarily bad, right? It wasn't, you don't have any type of thing where it's like you can point to some design and you're like, oh my God, what were they thinking? Like, all around, it's had very strong design, even when they've done pretty big departures like the Mr. Knight stuff, which started in the Warren Ellis run.
I think the most you could probably say is that sometimes his look is a little washed out. Like, if the artist doesn't highlight the stuff on the white suit, right, then it just looks like, oh, he's some guy in a white suit. So
Right.
sometimes I think that happened a lot in West Coast Avengers, where the costume didn't pop the way it really should have.
Yeah.
But in his own book, in the solo book, I've always thought that it looked good.
Yeah.
Maybe in some of the guest appearances and things like that, it just doesn't, maybe the artist just didn't have enough time to really like put the effort into the costume. But really, you're right, the designs have always been good.
I mean, Sienkiewicz, I think he had a real talent because, especially back then, it was really tough to do a character that was all white. Like the coloring process and all that was really, it wasn't as advanced as it is now. Mm-hmm. And Sienkiewicz had this talent of really kind of working with the environment and using almost like negative space in a way when he was drawing it. And that really kind of made it pop out. And that was a thing that not many other artists really had the same skill that he had to be able to really work with that all white costume, which was probably why in the Fist of Khonshu era, they added all the gold accoutrements and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, you need that. Sometimes, I remember this conversation about like Superman's trunks, right? Like people are like, oh, why does he wear underwear outside of his pants? But it's really to break up the visual a little bit, right? That's a big part of it. And so having the gold does help with that. I think other artists, I'm thinking prominently of Stephen Platt, who he did a lot of stuff around the shading, around the white of the costume. And so the costume was totally white, but the way that he had, he and his inker kind of like shaded everything. He highlighted a lot of the body, the physical kind of like musculature underneath the costume.
Right.
And I think that made it look really interesting. And I think Jeff Lemire also has done some really interesting art for Moon Knight. Right?
I think that was Jeff Lemire was the writer on that. I think it was Declan Shelby, I believe.
That's right.
Well, no, I think Shelby did the Warren Ellis run. I'm not sure who did it with Jeff Lemire.
So right now. I remember Jeff Lemire he's got the really great Khonshu design that pops up in the series, the bird design, but then also the costume during his run is, I think, also really cool looking.
Right.
And I think it has some really interesting elements. I also came across like an Earth X version of Moon Knight that looks more like a mummy than some of the other versions, right?
So it was Greg Smallwood who did the Jeff Lemire run.
Okay, yeah, he did a really great job in that.
Right, he's another artist who has that kind of like minimalist type style where he's able to make it work without using the too many lines or anything like that. So they're able to use like very much just flat white coloring as opposed to Stephen Platt, which his style doesn't really work that way. He's a very kind of, very much the 90s style with lots of line work, lots of rendering. So they used a lot of like blues and purples and like off white to handle the shading and that to really kind of make it pop. So that's kind of the background of this character. And, for most of the time when we talk about TV shows on this show, we tend to split them up a little bit. So we're gonna see how this works out with this. So we're gonna kind of front load this discussion right now with the first 3 episodes, kind of see how much we have to say about them, and then we might end up splitting this up into 2 episodes. But let's talk about those first 3 episodes. So we had the goldfish problem, some in the suit, and the friendly type. What was your thought on these 3 episodes?
So I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of the context of kind of Marvel as like dominant cultural engine, right? So one of the big complaints that you see online is people are always saying, well, Marvel's just doing the same thing. It's like a factory, here's this pre-processed, packaged thing, and you're either going to like it or you're not. Right. And I think the first episode, especially for Moon Knight, they departed from a lot of those things that we kind of take for granted. There's some jokes here and there, but it is off-putting. It's a very kind of shocking beginning, partly because you don't know what's going on with this character. Number one, the character has a terrible British accent. Like it intentionally, he's doing it poorly on purpose. Like this is not a real British accent. The character isn't dynamic or even that suave or funny. Usually the characters that we see in Marvel movies, they have some characteristic that you could really latch onto. Stephen Grant, as he's presented here, is kind of a fop. Like he's not, there's nothing there where you're like, really, oh, I think he's cool, I really want to hang out with him. You're really confused as to why the story seems to be about him, in the same way that like when he's in some of those adventurous moments with Harrow and everybody else, people are confused, like, what the hell are you doing here? You don't
Right.
belong here. But I think the ending sequence of the first episode is maybe one of the strongest moments. It's one of the biggest. The costume looks great. The costume reveal looks really good. But I remember when the episode first came out, I think people were kind of like surprised and they weren't sure what to make of it. And also, there aren't many. There's not a lot of connections to the larger MCU.
No,
in
very
the show.
yeah, very few direct connections. There are tiny ones if you're paying attention. There's little tiny things. There's like they have the GRC, the Global Repatriation Council logo on a bus, which came from Falcon and Winter Soldier. I can't remember how to pronounce her name, but the hippo character, she talks about the ancestral plane from
Right.
Black Panther. And there's some other tiny little ones here and there, but yeah, very, very few larger connections to the larger MCU.
Yeah. So I think that's one of the things that maybe made the show really unique and really interesting, and kind of drew me in a little bit. I was a little iffy on the first episode. I don't know. How did you feel as a fan of the character? How did you feel watching that first episode?
So I had kind of I think we both came at this from opposite. We both had kind of opposite reactions to it. Whereas the first episode, I love the first episode. That grabbed me right away. And I knew just from that first episode, I'm like, okay, this is really different from what I remember of the character. I mean, they've got the whole multiple personality stuff, but Stephen Grant is, they just completely invented a new reason for that character, a new personality type. All of that is completely invented by the show. And I think a large part of that was, I know that a large part of that was because of those Batman comparisons. They were worried that if they had him being like a suave billionaire like Stephen Grant is in the comics, right away people would be like, oh, he's Batman, but with Marvel. And I think, or also the other worry is if they have him be like this smooth, fast talking rich guy, then it'd be like, oh, it's Tony Stark, but now he's played by Oscar Isaac instead of Robert Downey Jr. So I think they were very intentionally trying to get away from that, which is why they crafted the Steven persona. And I didn't mind that change. I'm not so wedded to the idea that Stephen Grant has to be this billionaire suave guy. I thought what they did with him in that first episode, I thought it was really interesting. And I was there for it. I was on board for the ride, his whole, his blackouts, the whole, insomnia aspect, the chaining himself to the bed and all that kind of stuff. I for that first episode when he wakes up and he's chained to the bed and I'm just like, what's this? Right away, I'm just asking questions. And, for me as a fan going in, to make me ask questions and not say, oh yeah, I see that's a reference to that. That's a reference to that. I think that's a cool aspect of it. So even though it wasn't connected to the comics at all, at first, the show really grabbed me. As the show went on, and I think a lot of people who aren't Moon Knight fans, I think they kind of had this reaction, whereas I think Moon Knight fans had probably a little bit more extreme than my reaction. But as the show went on, I became a little bit more detached from it. Whereas my wife, she became more invested in it as the show went on.
Okay. See, that's interesting, because I definitely think that the show, one of the challenges in adapting the comic is that there are so many different iterations of the character that they really needed to remix this and come up with something new that would function on its own, because there's each iteration, the Warren Ellis Mr. Knight character is really different from the Doug Moench stuff. It's so starkly different that to kind of create a cohesive narrative out of that, I think they really they did the best that they could to kind of piece everything together the way that they thought they should. And I found that first episode, it was a little disorienting, because I did miss that moment of saying oh yeah, I know what that's about. I get that. I see this reference. It was more oh, okay, I have to actually keep up with it. I think the other thing is that the show really does require you to pay attention.
Yeah.
Right. You couldn't wash your dishes and then also just watch the show, because stuff happened and stuff mattered. And I think it's little things really mattered. So even the first shot of the show where Ethan Hawke is breaking glass and putting it into his sandals, that comes back later. And there's, it's a totally strange image, but it matters at some later point. So I really think that that's one thing. I'm not sure if everybody was prepared for that, for the level of detail and the level of concentration that they were going to need to really get on, to get the most out of it. But I like that. As I was rewatching it, I was like, oh, I'm picking up on a lot more stuff.
Mhm.
So if people like didn't really like the first time through, I might suggest you rewatch it just to see like if you could pick up on the story a little bit more and see a little bit more of the depth of what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And that I think that's one of the problems too, that you mentioned was because of all the different iterations. And I think that's one of the weaknesses of the show is that they're trying to pull from all these different iterations, but they're also trying to make it into something new. And I don't think it, at least for me, it doesn't quite all fit together the way I want it to. And it, in the end, it's been like, it started off really strong for me. And then by the time it's kind of funny. It's like the opposite of the reaction I had watching Hawkeye. Hawkeye, I became more and more invested in the longer it went on. Moon Knight, I became less and less invested in it the longer it went on. And it was a big part of that because it was just that the fact that I think also I get a feeling that the creators really they seem to be a lot more invested into telling a story about a superhero influenced by Egyptian mythology as opposed to telling a story about Moon Knight.
Yeah, I do think that, the version that we saw, and it's kind of clear in the first episode, because I don't really remember Moon Knight fighting a lot of Egyptian themed like monsters, right? That's not like his thing. I remember him fighting just like other mercenaries. Like his big villain is Bushman, right? Like another mercenary. So to see him fighting more mystical characters was a little bit surprising. But actually, as the show went on, I did enjoy kind of leaning into the Egyptian mythology of it all. I think that if they give this a season 2, you can always go back and do a Bushman type story. You can always go back and do a more mercenary oriented story that that might be a more direct adaptation of something from the comics. But to start off to say, hey, this is distinct, this is a little different. Here's this mystical stuff. Here's all this Egyptian mythology that you might not have seen or might not have expected. Over time, that really worked for me. It was a little off-putting in the beginning. I found the first 2 episodes when I was first watching them to be a little confusing. I was like, okay, I guess we're gonna move between these 2 characters, and we're gonna have the blackouts, and then we're gonna have this. But I thought some of it was good. I think the one thing that was really consistent throughout, I think the action was very good.
Yeah.
Across the series. For MCU TV shows, I think it's up there with Hawkeye in terms of action.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Like and I think the story is different enough. Your mileage may vary about how much you want to invest in it. But I think that's also due to the performance. I think Oscar Isaac, right out of the gate, I think does a great job. Did you see him as Moon Knight during the first couple episodes?
Definitely as Mark Spector. Like when he slips into the Mark Spector role, that's definitely Mark Spector. He was perfect, and it was a little off-putting at first to see Oscar Isaac, because if you had told me before I had seen the trailer for this or before I had seen the first episode that Oscar Isaac is going to play this foppish guy with a bad British accent, and he's going to look like a total incompetent mess who, he can't get his life together, he can't get a girl, all that, I'd be like, no, that's not possible. I mean, at the end of the day, it's Oscar Isaac, right? He's, the guy's suave. You can't. It was my problem with Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker, where I'm looking at him, I'm like, you are way too cool for Peter Parker. Like, you're awesome as Spider-Man, but as Peter Parker, you were just way too cool. You cannot turn that off. And I had the same thought about Oscar Isaac. I'm like, there's no way he could not be charming. And then I watched him in that first episode. I'm like, oh my God, he is really pulling this off. And then when he slips into the Mark Spector role, I'm like, it was so much like watching Christopher Reeve change from Clark Kent to Superman. That scene in the first Superman movie when he takes off the glasses and he stands upright. Very similar like that. That scene when he's in the bathroom and he's looking at himself in the mirror and he just completely transforms into a different guy.
Yeah.
I mean, if I didn't know better. You could have convinced me that was two different actors.
Yeah, or twins or something
Or
like
twins,
that. Yeah. I really think that the thing that really impressed me, not just the fact that Oscar Isaac is like, able to turn off the whatever charm he's got, he was able to tamp it down, but the scenes where he's speaking to himself, even in the first episode, where it's Mark speaking to Steven, they're distinct. Their vocal patterns are different. What their characters are really different. And it's just him playing against himself. And so as an acting exercise, it's really an impressive exercise to see him be able to pull this off and to be able to do that. I kind of think that, the other really good actor in this is Ethan Hawke. I think he's given a lot less to work with. And, it makes, like, his Arthur Harrow is meant to be menacing, but sometimes he just comes across a little bit kind of lackadaisical, maybe. I don't know. So he's not given as much to do to kind of compete against that Oscar Isaac performance.
I mean, it's such a hard performance to compete against too. I mean, it's just, he, like you were saying, those scenes when he's talking to himself, those were, aside from probably the action scenes, those are my favorite scenes in the show, was just watching him play off himself. And not only the vocal patterns, the tone of voice, but even just like the small little facial tics. Like, he really worked hard to develop these as each separate and distinct personalities. Even at the end, when we see Jake Lockley, right, in the last episode, we only get that one brief glimpse of him, but even in that, he is completely separate from Mark and Steven. And that is, I mean, I cannot say enough good things about Oscar Isaac. I've got a lot of criticisms of this show. I cannot say one bad thing about Oscar Isaac. He just knocks it out of the park every single scene he's in.
Yeah, he really committed, and you get that commitment right from the get-go. You get to see all of that, like, right from the beginning. And, especially for a guy like Oscar Isaac, who's, kind of a capital M movie star level actor, to kind of be this doofus and kind of be, especially in the first episode, to kind of come across as like totally lost, is, I think, is a vulnerable kind of performance. I think it's also really interesting that he is able to kind of show how, by being this like kind of lost person, and starting at Steven was also surprising to me, because I knew that Mark Spector was the main person. So I'm like, why are we spending so much time with Stephen Grant? That doesn't seem right. But I think that turned things around a little bit to show that having this multiple personality issue was causing problems, not just for our main character, Mark, but also for his other personality.
Right. I want to talk more about the Egyptian mythology aspect, because one of the things I loved about the comics, and which I feel like I think I would have appreciated this more. And like you said, they can go back and they can do the grounded stories where he's like in New York or wherever, and he's fighting, more of the standard Moon Knight villains. And yeah, that's all true. But they've let the genie out of the bottle in one aspect, and it's the aspect that, is Khonshu real or not? Because that's something that was always kind of this question in a lot of the Moon Knight stories. Like, is Mark really, does he really have powers? Is he really been resurrected by Khonshu, or is he just fucking nuts? Because just like you said, like in West Coast Avengers, when they're always wondering, why is he talking to himself? That was one of the kind of things. Like, there's always this idea of like, is Khonshu a real thing, or is this just, is Mark just so fractured from reality? Because we already know he's got these different personalities, that Khonshu is just another one of these personalities.
Yeah. So there's, you've seen this panel where Moon Knight is speaking to Punisher, right?
Yes,
like, there's a very famous panel where, Punisher basically asks him, like, "Oh, you still talking to your fake god?"
He's like, "How's your fake god?" He says, "He's good. How's your dead family?"
How's your dead family, right? We could get that joke in the MCU, but it's not gonna hit the same, right? It's not gonna hit the same, because we know Khonshu is real. We know Khonshu is an actual character. I think that the reason, or one of the pressures of putting Moon Knight out there, is to kind of create a big enough, villain or big enough story, and so you have to lean into the Egyptian mythology. So it's not just enough to have him like fight a mercenary or something. We got to start off by, having him save everyone from the Egyptian afterlife, or,
Right.
whatever. So I think that sometimes that's one of the criticisms I've heard a lot about Marvel, is that they're always trying to go for like the same type of ending or the same types of stakes,
Mhm.
and maybe that kind of stretched the story a little bit further than it needed to be, and took away one of the elements from the comics.
Yeah.
Though I do think that the focus here was, I think they were trying to be really careful about how they showed dissociative identity disorder, and
Mhm.
also to kind of um, to not treat Khonshu as another as another personality, just
Mhm.
to for the sake of treating him as as another personality. There is a very specific role that Khonshu seems to play, and that is like a very anti-hero type role.
Right.
And he's very much, it's funny that he hates Steven as much as he does. I don't know
Mhm.
if that's true to the comics, if he hates some of the personalities that Mark has more than others. But I did think that
I
was
don't
very
I don't
entertaining.
recall that being something in the. I could be wrong. I could be 100% wrong. Like I said, it's been a while since I've done a deep read through of the Moon Knight stuff, but
Mhm.
I don't recall him having like any real animosity between all the different personalities. I think there are some times when, which I thought the show did in a really cool way, to have like the Mr. Knight persona be like Steven's version of Moon Knight, and to have like the superhero version to be, which seemed also inspired by that Earth X take with the bandages and all that, to be more Mark's take on it. I thought that was a cool little thing, because there have been times in the comics when different personalities have had more control over him.
Mhm.
So like I think it was the Vengeance of Moon Knight series that came after the Charlie Houston stuff. In that one, I believe it was mostly the Jake Lockley persona that was driving things.
So can I ask, does Jake Lockley have a significantly different costume than the other characters?
No, it's just in that series, Moon Knight's costume was a little bit different, but it wasn't to the extent of the different personalities have different costumes.
Yeah, because there is a thing. We should spend more time talking about it when we talk about episodes 4 to 6.
Mhm.
But there's something with Jake Lockley that we don't really see him in in a traditional Moon Knight costume. So I did have a
Right.
question about that.
Yeah. Well, we also see some of that here. There's that one scene when Mark takes over the body, and I think this is in episode 2 or 3, and he sees all the dead people. He sees all the dead people, and he asks Steve, he's like, "Did you do that?" And Steven's like, "Are you kidding? I've been trying to stop you from killing everybody. It's not me who did that." So yeah, there are these little, and like you said, that's one of those things that when you go back and you watch the series all the way through, like me as a Moon Knight fan, my first thought was, "Oh, is that Jake Lockley? Is Jake coming through?" And so then going back, and then when you see the end, and then going back and watching all the way through, then you can pick up and then I see where the Jake stuff started now.
Yeah. I kind of knew that, because even in the end credits, they show you that he has 3 personalities, right? If you
Right.
watch the end credits, he's got 3 faces, and you're like, okay, he's got there's a third persona. There's this little Easter egg that's kind of hidden up until the very end. And I think that that's really interesting, that there's this like pressure to kind of figure out what Moon Knight is, where he happens to fall. I think it's also that they really wanted to introduce the character,
Yeah.
with as many of the personalities as possible, and I don't know if they wanted people to like wonder if Khonshu was real or not.
No, that definitely doesn't seem like something they were fixated, which is a choice. It's not a choice I necessarily agree with, but I can understand the reasons why they made that choice.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We're talking about the costume and everything. I think the costume design of the show is really good, except for Arthur Harrow. I feel like that costume could have been a lot better, and I didn't mind that. Like, Ethan Hawke is basically rocking like a Nehru jacket, and it's like he looks like that he was wearing something that my dad would have worn in like 1978. Which I find very funny. But I wish they had done a little bit more with the costuming for him near the end, when he gets, when he changes and things like that. But overall, costume design and production design I thought was very good, for this. And I really do wonder where they're gonna take things. And I did wonder that at the end of episode 3, about where things were going. I think they did a good job of with I know that the May Kalamaui character is very different from his wife in the comics, right? Like,
right, yeah.
she's supposed to be French in the comics, but
I can't remember if she's supposed to be French, but she's definitely supposed to be white. That's Marlene Allrain, I think is her name in the comics. And yeah, she has this relationship with him. She eventually leaves him, and then she's kind of a recurring character in the Houston stuff. And I don't know what she's up to now. I can't remember what exactly happened to her, but I think they ended up separating completely. Another thing you don't have in here is you don't have Frenchie. You don't have Jean-Paul Duchamp in here, which I thought it was. I can understand why, because they got so much stuff to deal with, and in a way, Layla does kind of fill both the Frenchie role and the Marlene role, so I can kind of understand why they felt Frenchie may have been too much, or may have been a little bit what's I can't, you know what I'm talking about though. I can't figure out the word I'm talking.
It would have been redundant, right?
There you go. Thank you. Yes.
You didn't, because I think they made a choice to have Layla take on more of those traits. And I think there could be a story that's just dedicated to Frenchie, to bringing him in as part of like the Moon Knight crew.
Right.
I think that's one of the things that maybe is missing a little bit from the show, is that because the show is so focused on Mark and on Steven, that you don't have as big of a ensemble cast as you potentially could have, right? It's really Oscar Isaac is his own, he's half man, half dog. He's his own best friend.
Right.
It's like, that's how this worked out. So I just think that, I'm amazed that Isaac was able to pull this off. I don't know how that's going to work if you bring in some of these other characters in a season 2. It'll be really interesting if they bring Moon Knight into another series or another show. Like if he pops up in Daredevil, what is that going to look like? Is he going to be popping between costumes and personalities and like making people really confused? Like, how is that going to work? So I'm interested in that, especially because now we've sort of got like 2 different costumes for 2 different personalities. What does that actually mean, right? Later on. But I do think that the Layla character, she's one of my favorite parts of the show, because I think they did a great job giving her a real arc. They gave her, it was nice to see her be a little combative with Steven and with Mark. And it's also, I think, nice to see a married couple vibe on an MCU show. That's one of the things I like about Ant-Man and Wasp. They definitely feel like they're a couple. Sometimes, sometimes the characters don't always feel that way. Like Pepper and Tony didn't always feel like they were a couple, because they were just doing corporate speak for a bit. So I really did think that was kind of nice, and they were a grown-up couple. That's the other thing, that they were like, you could tell they had some history, and they did a good job of kind of communicating that in the beginning. And I think she kind of comes across as a badass. She does a good job like helping him out and kind of saving him a couple of times. And I think that her connection with Steven is also really helpful to the core story. But I think that's also very different from from the comics. I don't think he has Frenchie, and not this, I don't think his wife goes on adventures with him, in any of the runs, really. To
an extent, not to the same extent that Layla does, but to a smaller extent, she gets involved in some of the cases. But one of the things you mentioned in there too is, the married couple vibe. That was something I really liked about them, and that's one of my favorite things about. I'm not sure if you watch Superman and Lois at all, but one of my favorite things about that show is the Clark Lois dynamic, and how they're this married couple and with all this history, and Tyler Hoechlin and Fitzy Tulloch, they really do a great job of making you believe that these 2 characters have been together for 15, 20 years. And it's a very mature relationship too. It's like, there's one of my favorite examples of this is when he has to do Superman stuff and he's not able to do something that Lois asked for his help with. And then when he comes back and she's like, look, I understand that you had to do Superman stuff, and and it's wrong for me to be mad about that. Logically, I know that, but I'm still mad. And, I just need a minute. And I'm just like, that was that made sense. That was a grown-up reaction to what was happening, right? It's you can't help this, this emotion that you're feeling, but at the same time, you can logically understand why it's ridiculous to feel that way. Whereas in most of the comics, when they do that, it does feel like the love interest is being petty and being selfish. So I like that they found a way to work that out and make it seem realistic.
Yeah, they did a great job with that. And now, Superman and Lois is on my list, but I may have to move it up a little bit if they
it's so good. It's so good. Yeah.
Okay. I gotta because I do love Superman, so I will put that on the list as well. But yeah, I definitely felt like, and you could tell they had some history, and I think it's kind of it makes the story a little bit more fun to have them kind of pair up. Especially when we get to episode 4, I think that in episode 3 as well, when they start to really do stuff together, you start to see some real sparks. I think it's also important because so much of comic book history is about like, oh, I need to hide my girlfriend from getting into trouble with me, or she can't know. So this dynamic, I think creates a much better, more equitable vibe. But I think it also came at the cost again of, I really felt like one of the weaknesses of the show was not Ethan Hawke as the villain, but he just didn't have as many people to really like bounce off of. Maybe he had a lot of followers, but nobody that was like at his level,
right?
Until the very very end. So that I think was kind of a limitation, a bit of the show.
Yeah, I do want to talk about that, but I want to mention one thing. I want to mention too about the Layla side of things is I like that they found a twist on the traditional superhero love triangle, right? The traditional superhero love triangle is you've got the superhero identity, the civilian identity, and the love interest, right? And that's the traditional love triangle, like Superman, Lois, and Clark Kent type of thing. They had a version of that, but it's an interesting take on it because you've got Mark, you've got Steven, and then you've got Layla. And and she knows they're both the same guy, but they're different aspects of the same guy. And she starts having these feelings towards Steven. I thought it was a really cool twist on that aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, like competing with some other side of yourself, but it's also really true about, I think in some relationships, depending on context, your partner may enjoy their time with you in a certain context versus another, right? And that's going back to like Carl Rogers's ideal self theory, right, where we talk about which self you can tend to activate. It's really interesting to see that you have this character who's able to kind of flip between these different personalities and still be appealing to the same person. I really like when I realized that they were just going to let Layla learn about all of these different personalities. I was like, oh, they're really going with this, and it worked. I was worried that it wouldn't work at all, and then it really it blossoms into something that I wasn't expecting.
Yeah,
right,
definitely.
I did enjoy that.
Yeah, I also did like the choice of doing an Egyptian spin on Marlene. I thought it was a really cool choice. Overall, I think it's pretty much everything about Layla, I think, is an improvement over Marlene from the comics. So that's one of those differences from the comics that I think works really well with this. The fact that, she's Egyptian herself, she's got this archaeological background, and her whole thing is, going out and finding these artifacts and stealing them back. I thought that was a cool aspect too.
Yeah.
And all of that kind of stuff. I loved all of that stuff. I thought that was a really, really good twist on it. And it made her feel a bigger part of the mythos as opposed to Marlene, who the only reason she hooks up with Mark is because of her father's connection to him. And so this makes her connection to Mark feel so much more organic.
It does. Though I have to say, haven't we all met somebody because of our dad for some reason, right? Who knew? I have to say that casting is a big part of this, and May Kalamaui, I think, is wonderful in this role. If you saw the show Rami, she's on that show. She's really great on that show as well. But here she really levels it up into superheroine action level. And I would watch totally separate action movie with just her as the star, because I think she does a great job carrying.
She does a great job and taking things and like, showing, what a capable character she is in her own right. I mean, some of those scenes when she's basically stringing Steven along and kind of like having to explain things and do things for him, and like, even like putting the harness on the right way. I thought all of that was really good. Now when it comes to the villain, now Arthur Harrow is such an interesting choice, and I think this is really kind of symbolic of kind of the issue I have with the show as a whole. Because if you try to find out what Arthur Harrow's background is in the comics, because I'm sitting there thinking as I'm watching the show the first time, I'm like, how come I don't remember Arthur Harrow? I mean, like, I've read like almost all the Moon Knight comics that are currently in print. How come I don't know this guy? I mean, because usually when they do the first, introduction of a character, they choose a villain that's very heavily associated with that character. So if you're doing Thor, you give him Loki. You're doing Spider-Man. Well, that's a different story because they brought in some other ones there. But Iron Man, you bring in Ironmonger. Eventually, you bring in Mandarin. All these different characters, you're bringing in some threat that they're very closely known with. And I couldn't figure out where Arthur Harrow comes from, and I looked it up. Turns out he's only in one issue of Fist of Khonshu, and it has nothing to do with the Egypt stuff. He's just they had created a villain for the show, but they didn't have a comic book counterpart for him. And then the writer said he was just looking through. Marvel had given him a list of all the villains who had appeared in Moon Knight comics, and he just saw the name Arthur Harrow, and he's like, "Oh, that sounds like a good name for a villain. I'm going to use that." And okay. I think that's one of the issues that I have with the series is they wanted to craft this story about an Egyptian mythology and an Egyptian themed superhero, and they wanted to do that story, and they just kind of fit that onto Moon Knight, regardless of it if it all fits together. And I think that's the biggest weakness for the show for me is it's a show about Egyptian mythology first and a show about Moon Knight second. Kind of like when we were talking about Iron Man 3, my biggest complaint about it is it's a Shane Black movie first and Iron Man movie second. I see a lot of that here with this show too.
See, that's really interesting. So that actually does explain why Arthur Harrow has like totally nondescript costume. Right. Like I don't know what they were thinking about it. And honestly, comparing it to the quality of the Moon Knight costume and one of the later costumes that comes up in episode 6, I'm genuinely surprised that they kept going with the same outfit for Arthur Harrow, because it was just bland. I was like, come on, you could do a little better for him, especially with the actor, the stature of Ethan Hawke, right? To give him a little bit more to do. Like, I understood that he was playing kind of a low key villain, and kind of not this like mustache twirling type of person. But I really thought that there might have been a few more notes for him to play, especially given the backstory that they give, where they basically say that he was the previous Fist of Khonshu. Right. He's the previous Moon Knight. And that doesn't really come full circle at any point. It's interesting in the first couple episodes to hear him talk about Khonshu and his relationship with Khonshu. And I think it's interesting that they really amped up the level of toxicity in the relationship between Khonshu and his avatar. Right? In leadership terms, he's a coercive leader because he's just forcing people to do whatever he wants. Right. So it's very interesting to see that, but there isn't this like full circle moment between Khonshu and Arthur Harrow that I would kind of expect.
Yeah. And another weird aspect of it is I think there was a way to do the Khonshu's past avatar aspect of Harrow and also make it more personal to Mark, because in the comic books, Mark's brother becomes a villain himself. First, he starts off as a serial killer, the Hatchet Man, and he injures Marlene. In fact, he kind of forces her into have a miscarriage, basically for her injuries, and Mark kills him basically, and then he comes back as the Shadow Knight, which is kind of like this opposite version of Moon Knight, and very much how and in fact it's kind of interesting because they took a lot of aspects from that Shadow Knight look, and like the whole bandages and stuff like that. A lot of that comes from that Shadow Knight look that his brother had. And they kind of incorporated that into Moon Knight. So I think if you had done the brother as the main villain, I think it would have been so much more personal, and it would also have had both for Khonshu and for Mark too.
So some of the decisions I think are in response to criticisms that Marvel has gotten. So one of the big criticisms is, the villain is always like somebody you're related to, or he had the same power, things like that. So maybe they were trying to create some distance. They also they used his brother in a very different way, which we can talk about in when we talk about episodes 4 to 6. But he pops up as something very different, which is an interesting choice. So I have some questions about what the thought process is beyond this season. Like where do they think they're going to take the character? So the Shadow Knight. Who else are the big villains? Bushman.
Bushman's a big one. Stained Glass Scarlet is a really intriguing villain. And in fact, that's another way that you could have had, especially amped up the mystery of it, because in the comic books, Stained Glass Scarlet, she's a woman who she marries this guy who's connected with the mob, and let me bring up her stuff really quick.
That reminds me of, the name alone reminds me of Typhoid Mary, right? Like,
yeah, definitely get that comparison. So she became a vigilante. Her son actually ended up becoming a criminal. She had been abused by her.
Oh, okay.
She had been abused by her father, and then she had killed her father by lighting his bed with a cigarette, and the death was considered an accident. Then she ended up marrying this small-time criminal, believing that she could kind of change him, and he also had abused her just like her father had, and he was gunned down completely unrelated on the steps of the church, and their son ended up becoming a criminal too. And she tried to save him from a life of crime, but she couldn't do it. So eventually she ended up killing him. And then she started hunting down criminals who have ever had a hand in turning her son into crime. She has this mysterious psychic bond with Moon Knight. So when she concentrates on him, she can manifest in his dreams and stuff like that. And I think you could have really kind of played with that aspect and played with it into, especially because these visions of Khonshu and all that, and all I think that would have been a really intriguing way to do the series too, is kind of have it more of an urban set mystery type of thing. And whereas you're not sure who here is a real person, who's not real, and I think that would have been a really interesting track to play as well.
Is there a definitive, if you were to tell somebody, here's the Moon Knight story, this is the thing you should read, and this is the Moon Knight story that could have been adapted, that you think they missed out on? Not so much. I don't think there's any, because Moon Knight stories, most of them are much more small in scale. There's there's not any, you don't have a Dark Phoenix saga for Moon Knight, right? It's just, it's very much a lot of these stories, they're 1-issue, 2-issue stories that happen in these bigger runs. So the Doug Moench run especially had a lot of this stuff where it's these 1-2-issue stories, and they're much smaller in scale, which is why I think one of the problems too is the format of these Marvel TV shows, right? Doing these 6-episode seasons. It's very much this kind of idea of we're doing a 6-hour movie in a way. I can't think of any Moon Knight story that really kind of fits that format. It's much more episodic, which is why I think if you're doing, which is, I think and it's ironic because one of the big issues that I had with a lot of the Netflix Marvel shows is they had too many episodes, and it felt like it had this kind of soggy, soft middle section. If you do a Moon Knight show and you do it 10, 13 episodes, but instead of having this idea of we have to have, it's one big story stretched out over these 10, 13 episodes, I think you do these 1-2 episode stories, and you have it much more episodic. I think that would be a much more interesting way to do it, because Moon Knight is so much more about exploring these different characterizations, these different relationships, than it is, a big picture story type of thing. So that's interesting, because one of the problems you mentioned with the Netflix shows is they're 13-hour movies, or they were just really long. I felt like the Netflix shows never had great single episodes.
Right.
Whereas I
yeah.
think the Moon Knight show actually has, like, episode 4, I think is really, really good.
Mhm.
I felt like the finale I really enjoyed. I kind of, I liked the way that the premiere worked, but it's still like a distinct unit of TV. Like, you just watch that and it's a complete episode beginning to end. Whereas with, like, I remember with Daredevil or with, God help me, Iron Fist,
Mhm.
things were just like happening sort of, and then it would just stop because they reached some sort of arbitrary minute limit. And it was
Right.
like, yeah, this okay. Now we're gonna start. Now this is over. We're gonna move on to the next episode. But I never got that vibe from this series. I felt like they had a better understanding of episodic structure.
Mhm.
Things carried over, but I definitely saw that there was, oh, here's an adventure. Here's some part of this adventure that's happening that's just this episode.
Right.
But you're right. I think that maybe something kind of like I don't know if you watched any of the CW DC shows.
Oh yeah.
So they did this thing in the CW shows where you would have a villain of the week
Mhm.
and then a little piece of like a continuing story.
Right.
So if you did that over 8 episodes where you have these little like episodic moments like, oh, this week we're gonna fight Bushman.
Mhm.
And then the larger story fighting against whoever Khonshu had a beef with, that would continue. Right. I think the Marvel shows are very committed to telling like one story over an extended period of time.
Right.
Going back to WandaVision and even Falcon and the Winter Soldier,
Mhm.
they're very, very focused on here's the story we're focused on, here's the thing we want, and we're gonna accomplish it in this time frame.
Mhm.
They could be helped by having some of those more episodic, shorter, smaller stories, especially for a character like Moon Knight that has that in the history. The reason I asked the question about like what story do you think should be adapted is I do think that there's something to be said for Hollywood adaptations where there's a clear through line of what the story should be.
Mhm.
Like if there's already like an arc in a story, here's something, oh, I'm just going to pull it and I'm going to build it out of that.
Mhm.
I think some of the wonkiness of this season could probably be attributed to Hollywood having to say like, okay, we've got all this stuff. Let's take all of this stuff, put it in a blender, and then out comes a show.
I think so too. And I think an earlier comment you made about this show kind of being Marvel almost responding to some of those criticisms. I think that's a very fair. I think that's a very good point. I think that's definitely playing into a lot of it, like playing against the idea of him being Marvel's Batman, the idea of having a supervillain who's related to the character or is like the dark mirror of the character in some way. All of that does kind of seem like they are almost kind of like afraid to go in those areas because they're kind of like prejudging what the criticisms will be, and then just intentionally trying to do the opposite because of that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they're also, we're what, 10, 13 years in to, this kind of amazing run, right? Actually, even longer, right? So 2008, almost 15 years in.
Almost 15, yeah.
And yeah, so they've got to reinvigorate the brand somehow. And I think maybe the Disney Plus shows are giving them an opportunity to maybe play around with the format and to maybe try out as like test balloons to see what people are interested in, what they like about it, what they, what they're responding to. I really, I wish there were viewership numbers for this show because I have no sense of how many people watched it or even how many people enjoyed it.
Right.
Because I really do wonder, like, I'm sure people tuned into the premiere, but I wonder if they finished the entire series, if there was enough there for them to really say like, yeah, this was cool. I really want to watch more of it.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure either. And I think that's one of the issues you have with a show like this is, how are we determining what the success is for it? It's right because you have very different standards from like the Nielsen system or with box office numbers. So, and they don't tell us what their standards are or what type of viewership numbers they're getting, so we don't really know. And a lot of it is just kind of like, I guess maybe in some ways I can understand why they don't do that is because then that kind of gives them the freedom to say like, well, we're going to kind of do what we want to do instead of doing what people are going to expect from us. So yeah, I think part of me is happy to see them, trying new things and experimenting a little bit. But at the same time, I think the whole idea of episodic storytelling it kind of feels like a lost arc almost, because so many TV shows now are so geared to the long form story approach that we kind of, and I think this is a problem with comic books in general today too, is that we kind of forgot that you can do these short stories in like one issue or one episode. And I would like to see, if you're going to play with the format a little bit, I would like to see a little bit more of that. Like, you know, give us some more stuff that is more episodic. I think it would be interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that I think Moon Knight's supposed to pop up in Werewolf by Night in the Halloween special.
Oh, okay.
Right, so it'll be interesting to see if they supposed to be like one episode or maybe two episodes. It'll be interesting to see what they do with that, because maybe they'll come back to that. Maybe they'll just do, like, I would watch a 75-minute, you know, Moon Knight movie where he's battling one specific character and we don't have to worry about, you know, the overall implications. Though I have to say that I do like the fact that there aren't any heavy duty MCU connections to this series. I like that it's its own thing, and it feels distinct enough that it can stand on its own. You know, yeah, especially because I think Moon Knight as a character is a little bit like that.
Well, let's push into talking about I figure we'll just do this all as one episode. So let's push into talking about the other 3 episodes as well. We can work those into this discussion. But I agree with you. I think it's one of the things that frustrates me about a lot of the MCU fandom is if they don't get all the cameos, they get annoyed and they get pissed off. And I'm just like, you know what? It's nice to see and I remember this with a lot of the Netflix shows or with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. when people were saying, oh, it doesn't have enough connections to the MCU. And I'm like, what the hell do you want? You want Iron Man flying overhead in every goddamn episode? I mean, it's okay. And you see that in the comics too. Like you have little connections here and there, but they're not gonna, you know, throw cameos in every single issue because that's ridiculous. You know, these characters have other stuff to do. So, and especially when you're talking about these, you know, when you're getting these actors in, like you can't have Robert Downey Jr. popping up in an ABC TV show.
Yeah. I do think that there's, well, I think this also has to do with age, because I think you and I both remember when these Marvel shows, even the DC shows, superhero shows, didn't have this level of detail or care given. Right. You know, this is as far from like the Roger Corman Captain America as we can get.
Oh, that was a Fantastic Four.
Was it one? But yeah. I think he did a Captain America too.
There was a Captain America one, but he wasn't involved in it.
Okay. So yeah, this is as far as that mythical like Roger Corman Fantastic Four as you know we can possibly have. Even the good stuff from that era, you know, related to Marvel, you know, even the stuff that was on like TV. I don't know if you remember watching the Hulk, Thor, Daredevil TV movie as a kid. I saw that and I was like, this is okay. It's not great. Doesn't look anything like what I wanted, but whatever. So my comparison point for what a good comic book adaptation is like very different, I think, from maybe the younger MCU fandom who are like, hey, we need to get these in. I do think that this kind of functions as an interesting side area of, you know, just, you know, like, oh, here we're in the MCU's version of Cairo. That was one thing I really loved, is seeing like a realistic Cairo. I visited the city when I was in high school and I really loved it. And it's really nice to see like actual Egyptian people pop up in an MCU show. You know, whether it's the cab driver, having that conversation with the cabbie, or having like Egyptian, you know, kind of thugs pop up. That was really fun. And I really enjoyed that part of it. I thought, wow, this is, you know, we're seeing not just like a character that's a little bit different, but a physical location in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that we never get to see. So, and you know, even the music is also like authentic Egyptian music, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, they definitely leaned on the Egyptian influences a lot in that, which I thought was cool. It's like this is where I got these two sides of myself that are warring with each other. Whereas I like all that stuff. I agree with you on all that stuff, but at the same time, as such a fan of the Moink 80s Moon Knight stuff, I'm like, man, I wish we could have had more of that.
Yeah, of course.
So I've got that kind of push and pull a lot, but and yeah, it is nice to see something that is not so, because yeah, like you said, when we were growing up, I remember watching Batman Forever, and when And when Bruce says to Dick, the circus must be halfway to Metropolis by now. And I remember freaking out as a little kid, like, Metropolis, Superman's in the same universe. Dad, Superman's in the same universe. And my dad's like, okay, yeah.
There we go. Yeah, I mean that was exciting when you knew that there was those connections. So I think that's really cool that we can have that. And I think this is a little bit of Marvel having its cake and eating it too, right? Like they're just like, hey, we can do this standalone story. I think it's also partly because it's really hard to fit Moon Knight into whatever the existing, Young Avengers storyline that they're trying to do. And I wonder if they're going to have. I mean, I've read some theories that they're saying that they want Moon Knight, Blade, and maybe Black Knight kind of like in a Midnight Suns or more mystical type team up at some point, which would be cool. But I don't think Moon Knight fits in that well with a lot of those other characters. We'll see if they can make that work.
I mean, I think this version of Moon Knight might fit in a little bit better than as opposed to the comic book version, because they're leaning so much on the mystical side of stuff. I think this one might fit a little, especially because we don't exactly know what kind of Moon Knight we're going to see with Jake Lockley. So that could definitely add more credence to that. Yeah, I could see a Midnight Suns things, but yeah, a lot of this stuff, like, I don't see how you link this series more to the larger MCU without it feeling totally tacked on. Right. I mean, I think they gave us a few little references here and there. They're very blink and you miss them type of things. And that's fine. I'm fine with that. I don't, that's on my list of things, of grievances about this show. That's not even on there at all. Like, I've got no problem with that aspect of it.
So can I ask, like, as the show went on, I started to like things more and more. Especially episode 4, I thought was a real highlight. It felt like Indiana Jones a little bit in the MCU, and I thought that was a lot of fun, especially with the Layla character. And I thought that, speaking about episodic stuff, I felt like the twist and the ending of episode 4 was terrific. But you mentioned that as the show had gone on for you as a Moon Knight fan, that you started to lose interest in it. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
So it's just it to kind of show you of how they were kind of departing away from the Moon Knight comics. You have Anton Mogart in episode 4, who actually is one of Moon Knight's classic villains in the comics, the Midnight Man. But he's, basically the only thing that he's got in common with the comic book counterpart is the fact that he's this, this kind of like art dealer, antiques dealer. That's about the only thing he has in common with him. And that's kind of a good way to look at it. It's like, it's taking stuff further and further away from the source material. It's leaning, and they're not bad episodes, right? I'm not going to say that this is a bad show or anything like that. It's very well done what they're doing. I think it's all really cool. I really like Layla's journey and how she eventually, and I think even the twist on the twist and the kind of like the revamping of the Scarlet Scarab character works pretty well in here. I think it's a good way to give her own kind of superhuman identity and to kind of update a character that was nobody really remembers anyway. So although I don't know why you wouldn't just call her the Scarab when she's got nothing scarlet about her, but that's another story. I mean, even the director, he had said that Marvel just kind of put the name on her after the fact. But other than that, like, I mean, it's just it's good. It's just not Moon Knight, right? It's kind of like how you remember the Constantine movie with Keanu Reeves?
Yeah, I do remember that. Yep.
Good, perfectly fun movie, perfectly entertaining movie, but that's not John Constantine. Like, as much fun as it is, as cool as it is to watch Keanu Reeves in that film, that ain't John Constantine, right? That's if you look over at Matt Ryan in the NBC show, that's John Constantine, right? So it's that kind of feel. Or also another good example is, thinking about this, Lucifer. Love the Lucifer TV series, right? So much fun to watch, beginning to end, just a total, popcorn TV show, right? Tom Ellis, brilliant performance, so much fun watching him in that show. If you've ever read the Lucifer comics that Mike Carey did, completely different from everything in the show. Like, the only things that are the same are you've got a character named Lucifer who's on Earth, he's got a demon pal named Mazikeen, and there's an angel named Amenadiel. That's about it. Everything else is completely different.
Yeah, and I think that's also a function of, like, being on network TV, being on, like, like the Lucifer comic. I mean, there's no way. I mean, that could have been like an HBO show, but
Yeah.
no way is
Oh,
Fox.
no way.
You know,
No way. Yeah.
yeah, like no way is that coming up as a live action adaptation. And I think that's where I think Moon Knight, they did really, especially near the end. When I was rewatching the last couple of episodes with the fight scenes, they really leaned into the action part of it as well. They really,
Mhm.
I think that's another criticism that Marvel has heard a lot, is that their action is just not that good,
Mhm.
and the third acts for most of their movies and TV shows, people don't seem to like very much. But I think this was actually a pretty good third act. You had a lot of nice little a few turns here and there. It was kind of interesting seeing two gods fight it out, in addition to their avatars. I thought that was fun. I think it was nice to, there was always like another little wrinkle that they put forward. And, I think it helped that I didn't have a strong attachment to the Moon Knight character,
Mhm.
that I kind of approached it, and I said, okay, I guess we're doing this now. I
Oh,
guess
yeah.
we're going to
Yeah.
cross the Egyptian Sea of the Dead at this point, right?
Yeah, I definitely think it, and like I said, my wife loved the show. She was much more invested in it than I was. Like every time I got home on Wednesday night for work, she was always like, "Oh, it's time. New Moon Knight is out tonight." I'm like, "Oh yeah, that's right." Like she was the one who was remembering it, and I wasn't, because I wasn't as invested in it as she ended up being. And yeah, I think if you're not a Moon Knight fan, you're going to be a whole lot more invested in this show than if you are a Moon Knight fan. I think if you look online, I think you see a lot of those reactions are very much the same. Like a lot of the Moon Knight fans, and they exist. We're not a big group, but we do exist. A lot of them have been very cold on the series, whereas a lot of people who aren't really as familiar with the character really kind of dug it a lot more. And I think, and I totally get that, that just because it's not the same as the comics, that doesn't mean it's not valid. And like I said, I love Lucifer. I love the Constantine movie. Although it did take me time to get to those points, right? The first time I saw Constantine in the theater, I fucking hated that movie. First time I saw Lucifer, I'm just like, this is really not what Lucifer is all about. And Lucifer, I ended up, just because it was such an entertaining show, and it was just it was on every week, and I just happened to be at the right place, the right time. I'm like, all right, yeah, I'll watch, see what it's. I have eventually, against my initial reactions, became a fan of it. Same thing with Constantine. At first, I hated it. Eventually, I came around to liking it. Maybe I'll have the same and I don't hate Moon Knight, right? It's not something I despise or anything like that. It's just right now, at this point in my viewing history with it, I am so much closer to the comics. In time, maybe I'll be able to come around to the show. But at this moment, it's a bit cold for me.
Where would you? So the way the character is right now, where would you like him to appear next? In addition to maybe a second season, like if you can get Moon Knight into a project, like a future Marvel project, like what do you think it would be? Do you see it as like Secret Invasion? Do you want to see him interacting with like She-Hulk? Like, what would be the cool kind of fun thing?
I mean, that's the hard thing, because it's very much like you were saying about when he was with the West Coast Avengers. It felt weird when he was there. Yeah. I mean, even when he was in, when Ed Brubaker was doing Secret Avengers, he put Moon Knight on the team, and it felt kind of weird seeing Moon Knight on the team. It was nothing against those issues, but it was just, he always kind of felt like the one who doesn't quite make sense to be part of this team. Also Nova too. I don't know why you put Nova on the Secret Avengers, but that's another story.
I mean, Nova at least has a history of being on a team. Like Moon Knight seems like less of a team guy than even Wolverine. People always say like, oh, he's not really a team guy, but he keeps popping up on teams. But at least there's something there. Moon Knight seems even less, like, especially if you're going with is he crazy, is he not version of him. He really doesn't fit on a lot of these teams, outside of like, and I feel like maybe Captain America tried using him for like secret missions during his Secret Avengers time, that he would go on missions for things that like Captain America couldn't, dirty his hands with or something like that. That I could kind of get. But for me, I would really like to see him maybe interact with Doctor Strange. I think that would be kind of fun. I think it would be kind of cool to see him interacting with some of the other legacy characters, not the cosmic characters that I think we're going to get, but seeing him maybe dealing with a Daredevil, or even a Punisher. Maybe it's not the same type of Punisher moment that we saw from the comics, but maybe something else.
It's also just kind of this weird, and I think it's the weird aspect of Moon Knight's character, because he's not quite a mystical character. He's not quite a street level character. He's not quite an A-list character. He doesn't really fit easily into one of these boxes. So because of that, it's kind of hard to really think about where I'd like him to be, who I'd like to see him interact with. I mean, like I said, the best Moon Knight stories have been kind of segregated from the larger Marvel universe. So, and anytime he does interact in those larger ones, you get occasionally like the Punisher moment, right? That's a fun moment, but you can't really do a whole movie or a whole TV show about that joke.
No, that's true.
And all the other times when he's been involved, it's always just kind of felt like you were talking about, the Midnight Suns thing, and him like doesn't quite seem like he belongs here. Like I could see him in but even in the Werewolf by Night, where he debuted, right? When he debuted in Werewolf by Night, the next time he appears, it's almost like a completely different character. So
I feel like, what is his origin story in that? Didn't Moeg talk about like the fact that he thinks that he's that he was just kind of somebody they threw in there, and then he developed him later?
Yeah, that's basically what happened. Like there wasn't, like you read that first appearance and then you go and read like Moeg's first issue of the Moon Knight series, and night and day, right? It's like it's kind of like you almost feel that some other guy was dressed up as Moon Knight in that first issue.
Well, there you go. Both dissociative identity sort of order.
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah. I mean, that's
maybe it was a different guy.
Right. But yeah, and also like you were talking about the third act. One of the issues I had with the last episode though was actually the God fight, right? It did kind of feel like, and I had the same feeling when I'm rewatching Shang-Chi, is it feels like someone higher up at Marvel is like, hey, wait, we need some CGI monsters fighting here in the background or something. And it took me out of it a little bit, because I felt like you compare it to when Shang-Chi is a good comparison, because you had this big CGI fight with all these demons and these otherworldly creatures fighting each other, and it felt really kind of hollow. Whereas what I wanted to see more of was the Shang-Chi Mandarin stuff, and whereas that was kind of overshadowed by this bigger fight with these dragons and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that with Shang-Chi, mostly because my favorite parts of Shang-Chi are like when the bus fight is the part that I really like. Yeah. Right. Like if I really, the third act really felt like, hey, let's get some big monsters in here so that people are kind of cool. But I feel like you could have busted out a couple of really big fight scenes at the end of some kind. Have him go back to his sister or whoever, and go back to that fighting arena. That would have been cool,
right? Or show some more with Razor Fist, or even the Death Dealer, who gets like, there's just that one brief fight scene. It seems like in all the trailers, all the lead up in the movie, he seems like he's going to be such a bigger focus, and then he just gets eaten by a CGI dragon, which is kind of a letdown.
Yeah.
And I very much kind of the same line, because with Moon Knight and with Shang-Chi, a lot of the best action that you can do with those characters, they're very grounded, much more realistic type fight scenes, right? I mean, you're not dealing with characters like Iron Man or Thor, who are a much better fit for that kind of like big CGI action. I mean, this is the time they're much more like a Daredevil type fight scene, where it's all very much grounded. It's real people, throwing punches at each other. I wanted to see more of that and less of the giant CGI gods punching each other.
So yeah, I definitely see. I actually really appreciated the fight scenes in this. I feel like the fight choreography is on par, with what we maybe a little bit less than what we saw with Shang-Chi, but they were pretty creative with how they used the multiple suits and the weaponry. I kind of dug the variety of weaponry that they had. I did get a huge kick out of the episode 3 fight where he gets stabbed by all those spears.
Mhm.
I thought that was really awesome. I think that was a great like badass moment. And also the moon cape thing, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I thought that was great. Like let's do that. I think they also kind of tried to maximize the use of Khonshu in terms of like,
Mhm.
hey, I can turn back time, and I thought that was really visually interesting piece, and I thought that was fun. So I think there's a lot of good, there was a lot of good stuff in here in terms of
Mhm.
just action, and also telling us a little bit about each character, because Steven's fights were just slightly different than Mark's, and we never, like Jake's fights are so shocking that we never even got to see them,
Yeah.
right? They were actually so overwhelming. So I actually really wonder where they could take the character. I do like that he's kind of at a point where he's got like at least one stable supporting cast member, and then
Mhm.
maybe in a season 2 we get Frenchie, we get some of the other folks involved as well. And I think the other thing that was cool is Arthur Harrow fighting Moon Knight. That was handled pretty well, even though
Mhm.
I don't like the costume. I think the fight scene itself worked really well. I kind of got a kick a little bit out of seeing Khonshu having to fight Amit a little
Mhm.
bit. Um, that was fun, but I think it could have been handled. If that was somehow removed, I don't think I would have missed it.
Mhm. I think the biggest thing I'd want if there's a season 2, which is still a question mark at this point, they haven't. Like Oscar Isaac said, he hasn't heard any discussions about a season 2. He'd be interested in it. Kevin Feige has said that Moon Knight will be appearing again in the MCU, but he didn't say anything about a season 2. So I think it was just more like he'll pop up somewhere else eventually.
Mhm.
So but if they do a season 2, I would like to see a much more grounded approach. I'd like to see them get involved with the Jake Lockley persona and like more of the supporting cast, like the waitress at the diner, Crawley, and Frenchie, and all those types of characters. I would have liked to see all that kind of stuff pulled in. And there's also something else that I want to quickly talk about, because one of the criticisms I've seen a lot online was the criticism over the fact that there's not a lot done with the fact that Mark is Jewish. And I, on one hand, I can understand that criticism to a certain extent, but on the other hand, I think that a lot of that criticism comes out of a misunderstanding of the character, because yes, he's a character of Jewish descent. He's got this Jewish background. His father's a rabbi, but he's not really a practicing Jewish character himself. So it's not a really big piece of his character in the comics. It's very much a part of his backstory, but not so much a part of his present. I'm not sure if you had any thoughts on that whatsoever.
So it's interesting. I love the fact that I didn't know that he was Jewish prior to, the scenes in like episode 5 and episode 6,
Yeah.
where you see him wearing a yarmulke. And I just kind of love that. I just kind of enjoyed the fact that I know I saw some complaints about Oscar Isaac not being Jewish himself, or not being of Jewish descent, because I believe he's Guatemalan.
Yeah.
Which I kind of didn't have a problem with, mostly because I think it was nice to have that level of representation, because you don't have a lot of characters talk about their religious background, and especially in that context, with the way they changed his origin story a little bit, so that the source of his dissociative identity disorder is really the abuse from his mother. I really think that is an important thing to kind of include, because that kind of explains some of the other elements of, like, sitting Shiva, and it created like a cool environment for that for that episode, because especially since they're dealing with the death of his brother, there's some very specific Jewish rituals and rites that you get to see that I don't think you necessarily get to see in every movie, and so I think it adds some weight.
Yeah, and I thought that was a big change from the comic books, is the whole thing about the relationship with the mother, the brother dying. And as much as I would have loved to see, the brother come back appear as Shadow Knight, like in the comics, or as the Hatchet Man, I did really like the way they handled the backstory. I thought that was so heartbreaking, and especially the fact when and talking about seeding things through and going back and watching things from the beginning, like you see the abuse that Mark experiences at the hands of his brother, and you go back and you watch the first episode and you see Steven, leaving all these voicemails for his, basically being a mommy's boy. And it's like how heartbreaking that is. That's like, all this guy wants is, he's wanted to have this close relationship with his mother, and he just, and then that gets reflected in Steven. And it's just like, again, that's something that was totally divested from the comic books, but that was something that they handled so well. That was so well done.
Yeah, I do think they did a really good job of just describing, showing a version of dissociative identity disorder. I don't think it's a perfect representation of the actual illness, just because I think that would be too rough for a Marvel Cinematic Universe type show. But for the purposes of this character, I think they handled it with a lot of sensitivity. I think they showed how difficult it would be to kind of function with that. And there is some research that seems to indicate that it is like a coping mechanism for people. So I think that seems to indicate, that was really handled very well. And I think that the other thing is that they included the mystery, the pieces of the mystery enough so that when things tied together, you understand why Steven talks the way that he does. I remember when the first episode rolled out and people were like, why the hell is Oscar Isaac using this totally fake British accent? He's not doing a good job with it. But when you understand it at the very end, like, okay, this is based on something he used to watch as a kid, that really has some value to it.
Yeah.
And I really felt like I would have liked to have seen maybe a little bit more about his family life, especially some of the stuff around Judaism. But I think that could be explored further in a second season and could really add some heft to that, because we don't get to learn a lot about his dad in this. We get to see a lot about his mother and how she reacts to the loss of his brother. But I really think there's a lot more that they can dive into, and maybe they kind of save some of that for another season.
100%. Yeah. I think, that stuff was handled great. And I think there is more stuff they could explore, like you said. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I believe his, it was abuse at the hands of his father, if I'm not mistaken, or just like, or some sort of something about that. I think there had something to do with his father more than his mother.
In the comics?
In the comics, yeah. I can't remember 100%, but I think there was something about that. But yeah, they handled it well, and I definitely felt for him in those scenes. And again, Oscar Isaac is just doing such a good job in this. I mean, even if you're a little cold on the overall series like me, I mean, you got to respect the work he puts into this series.
Yeah, the two main characters, Layla and Mark Spector, I think the performances are very, very good, and it would be a shame not to see them show up in another Marvel project of some kind.
Right.
Especially like one of my favorite moments in episode 6 is when she becomes the Avatar, when Layla becomes the Avatar for Tarawet. And I love that moment where she has her costume and somebody actually asks her, are you an Egyptian superhero? And I love that moment. I felt like, wow, this is great, because one of the cool things about the Marvel Cinematic Universe and comics overall, but especially the way that this Marvel Cinematic Universe is rolled out, is people are starting to be able to see themselves in the universe in a variety of ways. And I think that holds a lot of meaning.
Yeah, I mean, you can't, I mean, me being a cis white guy, I've never been at a loss of representation, right? And it's, it's always been like, I'm the default. So like in action and adventure stories, there's like a 99.9% chance that the character is going to be white and straight. And yeah, but just like, I can't know what that's like for other people, but I can only imagine, how amazing it must be after going your whole life without seeing any and yourself represented, and then to suddenly have that, and to have that for your kids, right? The director who's Egyptian, he talked about that moment when and how he wrote that moment for his daughter. Yeah. And that's a beautiful thing, I think.
Yeah, and but that's what makes Marvel fun, right? Like you can draw so much, and every time you add another character like a Moon Knight, you get to see and get to see them interact with somebody else. You have so much depth from that. Like we're struggling to think about how Moon Knight's going to interact with some of these other characters, but it's going to be fun.
Yeah.
This is the kind of like 10-year-old boy. I've got all these toys in my toy box. Let me smash them together type attitude that makes Marvel so much fun.
Right.
So I think that's going to be really cool to see some of these characters pop up. Maybe it's not a whole Moon Knight series, but it would be a shame to let Oscar Isaac as this character go to waste by not using him again in something else.
Now that I'm thinking about something else I might like to see is maybe another stab at the Defenders, but not the way that Netflix did it, more like the old comics did. So like you have Doctor Strange, you have the Hulk, you have Moon Knight in there, you can have all these other kind of like weird characters that kind of randomly get together. I think that would be really interesting to see.
That would be great. I did not care for the Netflix Defenders series. So
yeah, I mean, I was okay with it, but again, I love the Steve Gerber Defenders. I love the J.M. DeMatteis Defenders. So that to me is so like when I watched the Netflix one, I'm like, it's okay, but that's not my Defenders.
Yeah, I didn't have a problem with the characters per se. I just felt like the story, like it should have been maybe a 2-hour movie.
Yeah,
like if it went by faster, I might have forgiven a lot more of it. But they also wasted Sigourney Weaver. I think she was a good good villain, and they were just like, yeah, do something. And I hated the guy that played Iron Fist, so that made it really hard to watch for me.
He was, my favorite when I didn't really care for him that much in Iron Fist or in Defenders, but when he popped up in Luke Cage season 2, I thought he was perfect.
Oh yeah, he was okay in that. Yeah,
he was great in that. Guy. Like I thought he was so perfect in that, and I didn't understand why when they brought him back for Iron Fist season 2, they didn't use more of that style of his character. So that was a weird choice, I thought.
Yeah, I just couldn't. I don't know. I didn't vibe with him very much, and I'm glad Daredevil's coming in. I think that'll be interesting, and I don't know if they have plans on bringing Jessica Jones and Luke Cage. Those actors and those characters.
There's a rumor that Jessica Jones is going to be popping up in She-Hulk. I mean, I don't know how true that is, but we'll have to see.
That's a good fit. Now that you said that, that's a very, very good fit for those two, to be in the same, as good as Matt Murdock seeing, She-Hulk in his own series. That would be cool.
Yeah.
I don't know where Moon Knight, I don't know where he would pop up in some of the announced series. I heard, I saw somebody spitballing that maybe Blade and Moon Knight could have some interactions. I would love to see that. I think that would be really fun. In sort of a
Morbius.
Morbius, maybe. I mean,
I don't think Marvel's going to try anything with Morbius after that movie came out.
I mean, can Moon Knight just beat up Jared Leto? Like, is that possible? Like,
I mean, I kind of want to see him beat up Jared Leto. Let's say that.
There we go. I mean, we'll call him Morbius, but whatever.
Yeah.
I did hear somebody suggest that they wanted Sam Raimi to direct Morbius 2, which would be fun, but I don't know, like, how if I really want Sam Raimi to take his time to make Morbius 2.
Yeah, I just want to see after Multiverse of Madness. I just want to see Sam Raimi do more Doctor Strange.
Oh yeah. I really enjoyed Multiverse of Madness as well.
Yeah, I did too. But I just want to see like more of that stuff. Like he's got the, just see him go nuts with the campy horror and stuff that he used to such great effect in that movie. Like, and the biggest, and we had actually just done it on a recent episode, and hasn't been released when we're recording this yet. But when we were talking about it, the thing we came about was like, one of the problems with the movie is that it's not enough of a Doctor Strange movie. So I want to see, Sam Raimi just go nuts on doing like a pure Doctor Strange movie. I think that'd be so much more fun.
Yeah, I actually would. I think it might be really fun to let Moon Knight hang out with Doctor Strange and Sam Raimi is directing. Because one common thread in a lot of Sam Raimi movies is this idea of doppelgangers, different versions of yourself. That's why he fits so well with that Multiverse of Madness. Because if you, I'm going to assume that you've seen like Army of Darkness and Evil Dead 2 and all of those, right? So there's always those multiple character, the Ash being a different version of himself, or you see that even in Ash versus Evil Dead, you see that pop up. So I would love to see him deal with Jake Lockley and all the different versions of Moon Knight, and see how he interacts with Stephen Strange.
Oh
right?
yeah,
I think that might be kind of fun, especially because Doctor Strange doesn't do a lot of like physical combat, so
Right.
having him pop up with Doctor Strange would be kind of cool.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. I wasn't so sure about when you mentioned at first, but you just completely sold me on it. I'd like to see that.
All right, Marvel, hire me to write this.
Yeah. Okay, Sai. Anything else you want to say about Moon Knight? I think I've pretty much said everything I got to say about it.
So I think one of the things I really want to thank Marvel for is the fact that they actually hired Egyptian directors, Egyptian musical crews, a production crew on Moon Knight, because that really it's something that shows the level of care that they put into kind of representing Egypt. And having spoken to some friends who are Egyptian that watched the show, they really appreciated it. They were like, wow, this is amazing that we're you can tell the music choices that they have in the end credits, they're Egyptian musicians. It's really nice to see a Cairo that is a lived-in city versus just like, oh, here's some pyramids, now we're in Cairo. Because Cairo is a really awesome city. It's full of really cool people. It's a great place to visit. And it's the kind of thing where, you're really getting the maximum value out of, using the character. And I hope that maybe you can take, this character and, add more stuff and put him into, some of those traditional stories from the comics. And I would actually hope that the producers, I think Jeremy Slater and a few other people, or some of the writers and producers of the show, just look back and you could do sort of a 6-episode season with maybe some standalone episodes with a little bit of continuing story with some of the characters that some of the villains that you mentioned. And I'll also say that the Moon Knight show has kind of sold me on exploring the character a little bit more fully. Because before the show, I was kind of like, I have no idea what the hell this is. I have no idea where I'm going to go with this character. But you know what? Maybe I'll pick up some TPPs and see what's out there. And now that I know that Charlie Houston's run is a good one, maybe I'll start there.
Yeah, the Charlie Houston run, it's a good one. It's more modern. It's got more modern sensibility. So it's but the Moink stuff, it's also really good. It's just like, it was very much ahead of its time. I don't think a lot of people could really, because it wasn't quite as as like gritty as you might expect from like Daredevil Frank Miller, but it also but it was a lot more cerebral as well. So it's like this weird mix between like Frank Miller and Alan Moore type stuff from the 80s. Like if you look at like some of the stuff Alan Moore was doing over like Swamp Thing or that kind of stuff, right? A lot of that philosophical type of stuff. It had a lot of that in there, but I think it didn't really quite appeal to either audience that was into either of those things. I think that was kind of the weakness that it had back at the time. But like, definitely go back and look at, I think pretty much all the Epic collections are from Moink's run, especially the stuff when Sienkiewicz was doing the art, magical. Definitely read that stuff. And also like the Jeff Lemire stuff was really good too, especially if you like the stuff when they were in the mental hospital. Lemire played a lot with that. Like all that came straight out of Lemire's run.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I hope that they can expand a little bit and expand the supporting cast, because I think it'll be more interesting to see Mark and Steven interacting with a bigger supporting cast, especially the way that if you go back to those like Shadow type roots, that might be really cool.
Yeah, so absolutely.
There's a lot to be done with the character, and I hope they don't let him sit on the shelf for too long.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, Sai, you want to tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at IOSciIslam. You can find my book on Amazon. If you go to tinyurl.com/AmazonMCU, it'll take you right to the book. And if your company's looking for consulting services with hiring or team building or anything like that, you can find me at talentmetrics.io.
Okay, well, Sai, thanks so much for coming back on. It was a lot of fun talking about Moon Knight. So, and as always, you're more than welcome to come back sometime.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Thank you. All right, that does it for this episode of Superhero Cinephiles. SuperheroCinephiles.com is the website. Super Cinema Pod on Twitter and Instagram. And if you sign up for our Patreon, you get these episodes come out a week early for you. And we got some other stuff that's going to be dropping out on the Patreon soon. So basically, you get that stuff no matter what level you're subscribed at. So subscribe at $1, subscribe at $100, whatever you want, you'll get the same content. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. If you enjoy the Superhero Cinephiles, then you'll also love my companion podcast, the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club. All my Patreon subscribers get access to this exclusive podcast where I review superhero comics and graphic novels. Not sure what comics you want to read next or what you should dive into? I've got you covered on that. I'll be doing reviews, recommendations, and also talking to you about useful entry points if you're interested in reading some comics but don't know where you should start. Plus, you'll get access to all episodes of the main show a week before everyone else. On all of this for as little as just $1 a month. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/supercinemapod and you can sign up at any subscription amount to get started. Thanks so much for your support, and please don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.